It was a perfect summer afternoon in one of Atlanta's most prestigious neighborhoods. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden reflections on the shimmering surface of a crystal-clear swimming pool. A gentle breeze rustled the neatly trimmed hedges surrounding the backyard, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. It was peaceful. It was everything Michael Carter had worked so hard for. 15 years on the police force had shaped him. Long shifts, difficult cases, and countless nights patrolling the city. But through it all, he had held onto one dream: owning a home, a real home, where he could finally put down roots. And now, after years of saving, working overtime, and making sacrifices, that dream had come true. His two-story house stood proud, a testament to everything he had accomplished. The pool, the patio, the quiet luxury of his own space. It was his reward for a life of service. Michael leaned back in his lounge chair, eyes closed, soaking in the warmth of the Georgia sun. The world for once felt calm. And then, sirens. The sharp wail of police sirens shattered the tranquility. Tires screeched against the pavement as not one, but two patrol cars came to a sudden stop in front of his house. Michael sat up, a sinking feeling forming in his gut. This wasn't normal. From his seat on the patio, he watched as the officers stepped out, their hands resting near their holsters, a stance he recognized all too well. They moved with purpose, approaching his fence with cautious authority. "Sir," one of them called out, "we've received a report of a suspicious individual trespassing in this pool area." Michael inhaled deeply, willing himself to stay calm. He had been in enough situations like this to know that appearances could be deceiving, but the sinking feeling in his chest told him he already knew exactly how this had happened. Through the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shift of curtains, a flicker of blonde hair. And then, there she was, his neighbor, Karen Thompson, peering through her second-story window with a smug, satisfied smirk. This wasn't the first time, and if Michael had anything to say about it, it was going to be the last. 2 months earlier, when Michael had first moved in, he had been filled with nothing but pride. Standing in the doorway of his new home, surveying the spacious rooms, the polished floors, and the sunlit backyard, he had felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. He had done it. For years, his parents had dreamed of home ownership, but never quite managed to break free from renting. He had grown up watching them work tirelessly, always hoping for more. Now, he had turned that dream into reality, not just for himself, but for them too. The house was in immaculate condition, thanks to the previous owners, who had clearly cared for every inch of it. But the real selling point had been the pool. As someone who had spent so much of his life working in the heat, Michael had always imagined the luxury of diving into his own private oasis at the end of a long day. That dream, however, had come with an unexpected complication. The first time he saw her, Karen Thompson had been standing at her upstairs window, phone pressed tightly to her ear, watching him intently. There was something unnerving about her gaze, something that made Michael feel as though he had been evaluated and dismissed in the same breath. Still, he had given her the benefit of the doubt. He had lifted a hand in a friendly wave, a simple neighborly gesture. But instead of waving back, Karen had simply turned away, disappearing behind her curtains. Michael had shrugged it off at the time. Maybe she was just private. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she was one of those neighbors who preferred to keep to themselves. But looking back now, sitting by the pool with police officers standing at his fence, Michael realized something. That moment, that very first interaction, had been a warning. He just hadn't seen it yet. The next day, Michael was out running errands when his phone buzzed with an alert from his home security system. A motion sensor had been triggered in his backyard. He frowned, opening the app to check the live feed. The image that appeared on his screen made him pause in disbelief. There, as if she owned the place, stood Karen Thompson. She had let herself in through the backyard gate, completely uninvited. Dressed in an expensive designer swimsuit, she had draped a luxury beach towel over one of Michael's lounge chairs and was now casually dipping her feet into his pool, her face tilted toward the sun in pure relaxation. Michael felt a surge of anger. He had just moved in, and already his neighbor had decided that his home was hers to use as she pleased? By the time he arrived back home, Karen was still there, lounging like a guest at a private resort. Michael parked, took a deep breath to steady himself, and walked toward her. "Excuse me," he called out, keeping his voice even. "Can I help you?" Karen turned, one hand lazily shading her eyes, as if only just noticing his presence. Then, placing a delicate hand to her chest, she gasped in mock surprise. "Oh," she exclaimed, eyes widening theatrically. "I thought you were the new pool maintenance guy." Michael stared at her, unimpressed. "I'm not the maintenance guy," he said, keeping his tone professional. "I'm the owner of this house." Karen's smile froze for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. She let out a small, dismissive chuckle and waved a hand as if to brush away his words. "Well, that's unexpected," she said lightly. "The previous owners always let me use their pool. It's just a little routine of mine." Michael's jaw tightened. He had no doubt she was lying. "I appreciate that, but I prefer if you asked for permission before entering my property," he said firmly. Karen's expression shifted just slightly, but enough for him to see it. The polite mask cracked, and something uglier lurked beneath. "You're the owner?" she repeated, as if the very concept were unbelievable. Michael could see the hesitation in her eyes, the way she paused, as if searching for the right words. Then, she gave a small, uncomfortable laugh and gestured vaguely in his direction. "There must be some mistake," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I know the realtor handling this property, and she never mentioned, well, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to." Michael held her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had spent 15 years as a cop. He had heard it all before. "There's no mistake, Mrs. Thompson," he said coolly. "This is my home, and you're trespassing." For a moment, Karen just stood there. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she gathered her things, her expensive towel, her designer sunglasses, her entitled attitude. As she walked past him, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "We'll see about that." It wasn't a comment. It was a promise. A dangerous game begins. Over the next few weeks, Michael began noticing more and more of Karen's antics. It started with small things, little annoyances that, on their own, might have seemed petty. One morning, Michael woke up to the sound of splashing and laughter outside. Still half asleep, he pulled back his bedroom curtain and couldn't believe his eyes. Karen had brought friends. There were 4 women in his backyard, lounging on his patio furniture, sipping cocktails like they were at a country club. Karen herself was floating on an inflatable pool lounger, her sunglasses perched on her nose, completely at ease. Michael stormed outside. "Excuse me, what the hell is going on here?" Karen barely glanced at him. "Oh, Michael," she said breezily. "Don't be so dramatic. We're just having a little fun. This pool barely gets any use anyway." Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "This is private property," he said, his voice sharp. "You and your friends need to leave. Now." The other women shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. One of them looked guilty. Karen said she had permission. One woman mumbled, already grabbing her things. Michael turned to Karen. "This is your final warning," he said coldly. "Next time, I'm calling the police." For the first time, Karen's expression hardened. Then, she smirked. "Go ahead," she said, standing up slowly. "Call them." She turned, adjusting her swimsuit strap as she stepped onto the patio. "My husband plays golf with Captain Richards," she added. "I know everyone at the precinct." And with that, she strutted away, leaving wet footprints across his tiles. Michael stood there, his fists clenched. Karen had just declared war, gathering evidence. Michael wasn't a fool. He had spent years on the force. He knew how to handle people like Karen. He installed more cameras, this time hidden in strategic places. If Karen thought she could get away with anything, she was wrong. And sure enough, the footage didn't disappoint. Karen was caught, testing his back gate when she thought no one was watching, peering into his windows late at night, trying an old key on his door, a copy she must have kept from the previous owners. But the final straw came when he arrived home one afternoon to find something that sent his blood boiling. Karen had hosted her book club in his backyard. 8 women sprawled out on his patio furniture, drinking wine, flipping through novels, and acting like they belonged there. Michael had had enough. He pulled out his phone, and this time he made the call. A showdown with the police. 15 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of his house. Michael recognized the officers immediately. "Mike, long time no see." Officer Davis greeted him, then glanced toward the backyard. His expression changed. "Oh, it's this kind of call." Before Michael could say anything, Karen rushed forward, her eyes wide, her voice laced with feigned distress. "Oh, officers, thank God you're here," she cried. "This man is harassing us. We've always had permission to use this pool. He's being completely unreasonable." Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "Michael Carter was one of our best officers. If he says you're trespassing, you're trespassing." Karen's face flushed red. "Please leave," Officer Davis added, this time more firmly, "before we have to make this official." One by one, Karen's book club scattered, hurrying past Michael with their heads down. Karen, however, hesitated. She turned to Michael, her face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You don't belong here, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Then she stormed off. Michael watched her go, his expression unreadable. Oh, this wasn't over. But Karen had no idea what was coming next. Michael thought Karen might finally back off after the police had escorted her and her book club out of his backyard. He had given her multiple warnings, and now, with law enforcement involved, any reasonable person would take the hint. But Karen Thompson was not a reasonable person. If she couldn't win by force, she would win by manipulation. At first, it was subtle, small whispers creeping through the neighborhood, a few awkward glances from neighbors who had been perfectly friendly before. Then the online attacks began. A series of anonymous posts started appearing in the community's Facebook group. "Have you noticed anything suspicious about the new homeowner on Willow Creek Drive? Strange activity at the old Jensen property. Wonder if the HOA is aware. Some of us are concerned about what's happening to the character of our neighborhood." Michael wasn't naive. He knew exactly where these messages were coming from. He had dealt with enough liars, con artists, and petty criminals in his years on the force to recognize a smear campaign when he saw one. Then came the HOA complaints. At first, they were almost laughable. A formal notice arrived in his mailbox, claiming that his lawn was unkempt and in violation of the neighborhood's landscaping policies. Michael walked outside and looked at his perfectly manicured grass, freshly mowed and edged. It was in better condition than most of the other homes on the street. The next complaint accused him of having an unauthorized structure on his property. Confused, Michael checked the description. It was his patio umbrella. Then, his morning newspaper started disappearing. At first, he thought maybe the delivery had been inconsistent, but after the third day, he checked his security footage. And there she was, Karen. At exactly 6 a.m., she tiptoed up his driveway, snatched the newspaper, and hurried back across the street. Michael saved the footage. A few nights later, another alert from his security cameras woke him up. He checked the feed and found Karen in his front yard again. This time, she wasn't just stealing his newspaper. She was taking photos of his house. She moved slowly, circling the property, snapping pictures of the exterior like she was gathering evidence for a crime report. At one point, she even pressed her face against one of his windows, trying to see inside. Michael didn't confront her. Not yet, because then she crossed the line. One morning, as Michael stepped outside, he noticed something off about his prized rose bushes. The vibrant, blooming flowers had begun wilting overnight, their leaves curling in on themselves. A sickly yellow hue had begun creeping through the plants. He knew sabotage when he saw it. Sure enough, when he checked his cameras, the footage was crystal clear. At 3:24 a.m., Karen had crept into his yard under the cover of darkness, a small plastic container in her hands. She knelt by his flower beds and sprinkled something over the plants, taking her time to ensure an even spread before slipping back across the street like a ghost. That was it. Michael wasn't just going to stop her. He was going to end this. The HOA meeting, a public reckoning. The next HOA meeting was packed. Whether it was curiosity, neighborhood drama, or the general love of gossip, nearly everyone had shown up. Even people who never attended had found a reason to be there. Michael sat calmly near the back of the room, waiting. Karen, on the other hand, had positioned herself at the front. She was dressed for battle, wearing an elegant blazer and a self-righteous expression. When the meeting began, she immediately took the floor. "I'd like to address a growing concern about our community," she announced, her voice carrying through the room. Some of the board members exchanged glances. "There have been certain changes in the neighborhood," she continued. "Changes that have made some of us very uncomfortable. As a real estate professional, I know how important it is to maintain our property values. And frankly, there have been incidents that don't align with the standards of this community." She didn't name Michael outright. She didn't have to. Every passive-aggressive glance in his direction made it clear exactly who she was targeting. Michael let her talk. He let her ramble about the decline of the neighborhood, the so-called disturbances, and her concerns over who might be moving in these days. When she finally paused, the room was silent. Michael stood. "Interesting points, Mrs. Thompson," he said smoothly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Since we're discussing property values and neighborhood integrity, I'd like to show the room something relevant." With one tap, the screen behind him lit up. The first clip played. Karen, sneaking across his lawn, stealing his newspaper. A murmur spread through the room. The second clip, Karen walking around his house at night, taking pictures through his windows. Gasps. The third clip, Karen, under the cover of night, dumping plant killer onto his roses. Dead silence. Every eye in the room turned to Karen. Her face had drained of color. "That was," she stammered. I was investigating." "Oh, I agree, Mrs. Thompson," Michael said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "There definitely was a suspicious individual sneaking around my property." A few people chuckled. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. The HOA president cleared her throat. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," she said carefully, "given this evidence, I think we'll need to reassess your concerns about property values." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but it was over. The room had turned. The whispers that had once been about Michael, they were about her now. She stormed out, her face red, her perfectly styled hair bouncing with every angry step. Michael simply took his seat, folded his arms, and smiled. Karen had started this war, but he was going to finish it. Michael had played defense long enough. Karen had pushed, tested, and trespassed her way into his life, treating his property like her personal playground. He had tried reason. He had tried the law. But Karen didn't respect rules. So, if she wanted to keep playing games, Michael decided it was time to play one of his own. The idea came to him late one night, as he sat on his back patio, staring at the very pool Karen had been so determined to claim. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight, but all he could see were the countless unwanted intrusions. Her lounging like a queen, her arrogant smirk, her friends treating his home like a resort. And then, he remembered a conversation with an old colleague. It had been years ago, during an investigation into a community pool vandalism case. The maintenance crew had used a harmless dye to detect leaks, a special compound that remained completely invisible in water but reacted when it came into contact with certain chemicals. Specifically, high-end sunscreens and expensive beauty products. Michael's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. Karen and her friends had one thing in common. They wouldn't be caught dead using drugstore sunscreen. They lathered themselves in luxury brands, the kind that boasted hydration, anti-aging, and UV protection. And that was exactly what Michael needed. Over the next few days, he did his research. He ordered the perfect formula, a completely safe, non-toxic dye used in professional pool maintenance. It would only activate on contact, staining skin, hair, and anything else that had been coated in specific cosmetic ingredients. He tested it first, just a small amount in a bucket of water. He added a drop of the exact sunscreen Karen had left behind on one of his lounge chairs. Within seconds, the water around it flared bright green. Perfect. The setup. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood. and Michael had no doubt that Karen was planning another unauthorized pool party. She wouldn't accept defeat so easily. He overheard her talking on the phone from her backyard, voice loud enough to carry over the fence. "Yes, he's usually gone all day on Saturdays," she said. "Trust me, it'll be fine. Bring your best swimsuit." Michael smiled. That Friday night, he made his final preparations. First, he installed extra cameras to ensure he had multiple angles of the pool. He wanted every reaction captured in high definition. Then, he added the dye to the water, carefully following the manufacturer's recommended concentration. To the naked eye, the pool looked completely normal, the same inviting, crystal-clear blue it had always been. And finally, he left. Or, at least, that's what he wanted Karen to think. The pool party begins. Early Saturday afternoon, Michael packed his car, making a show of loading up his trunk. He even pulled out of the driveway, waving casually at a few neighbors as he left. But instead of heading into town, he parked around the block, then walked back home through a side entrance, slipping unseen into his home office. From there, he had a perfect view of the backyard. His phone was open to his security feed, and all he had to do was wait. Right on schedule, Karen appeared at his back gate. She did her usual check, glancing around, ensuring the coast was clear. Then, with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable, she pushed open the gate and strode inside. This time, she had brought a full entourage, 6 of her friends, all carrying expensive beach bags, all dressed in designer swimsuits. "Ladies," Karen declared, lifting a bottle of champagne, "welcome to our Saturday sanctuary." There were a few nervous giggles, but the excitement of a private pool party quickly drowned out any hesitation. Michael leaned back in his chair, watching as the show began. One by one, they slathered on sunscreen, rubbing it into their arms, their legs, their faces. They adjusted their wide-brimmed hats, slipped off their cover-ups, and waded toward the pool's edge. Karen was the first to dive in. She made a graceful splash, emerging with a satisfied sigh. "The water's perfect," she called out. "Come on in." Her friends followed, laughing, splashing, completely unaware of what was happening beneath the surface. The green awakening. It started subtly. A woman near the pool's edge frowned, rubbing at her arms. "Karen," she said hesitantly, "is your skin looking different?" Karen glanced down at her hands, squinting in the bright sun. For a split second, she didn't understand. And then she saw it. Her skin was turning green. Not a light tint, not a faint discoloration. A full, vivid, unmistakable emerald green. Her shriek split the air. The other women started noticing it too. Their legs, their arms, their faces, every inch of skin where they had applied their luxury sunscreen was changing color before their eyes. Screams of pure panic filled the yard. One woman scrambled out of the water, looking down at herself in horror. "Oh my God," she wailed. "I have a wedding next week." Another woman, her face streaked with green, turned toward Karen in shock. "What's happening?" Karen was hyperventilating, frantically rubbing at her skin, but the more they scrubbed, the worse it got. The dye had set in, and it wasn't coming off anytime soon. Then, one of them spotted a camera. A tiny, blinking red light. Karen froze. Michael watched in satisfaction as realization dawned on her face. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some freak chemical reaction. This was intentional. The Great Escape. The women fled. Dripping wet, stained bright green, they ran screaming through the neighborhood, leaving behind green-tinged footprints on the sidewalk as they went. Michael let out a low chuckle, rewinding the footage to make sure he had captured every second. Oh, he had, and it was gold. By the time he finally stepped outside, the yard was a mess. Abandoned towels, spilled champagne, forgotten sunglasses. The only thing missing was Karen and her entourage. The pool, however, had never looked better. Michael took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in months. Karen had spent weeks trying to embarrass him, trying to make him feel like he didn't belong. But now, she was the one hiding indoors, while the entire neighborhood laughed at her. Michael pulled up his phone, watching as the security footage began circulating through local social media groups. By nightfall, the video would be everywhere, and Karen Thompson would never live it down. By the time the sun set that evening, The neighborhood was already buzzing. The echoes of Karen's emerald green escape were still fresh, but the real storm was just beginning. Michael sat back in his chair, scrolling through the video clips on his phone. He had stitched them together seamlessly, every moment captured in perfect clarity. The footage opened with Karen's countless intrusions, each one time-stamped, followed by the grand finale. 6 shrieking women, streaked in bright green, fleeing down the street like a scene from a bad sci-fi movie. And the best part? The background music. A smooth, slow jazz tune, the same one Karen had played during her illegal pool parties, gently accompanied the chaos, giving the video an almost cinematic elegance. Michael hit upload. Within hours, the internet had spoken. Trespassing Karen gets green with envy. Pool party gone wrong. Entitled woman gets what she deserves. The Wicked Witch of Willow Creek. The video spread like wildfire. It was shared, reshared, and dissected by thousands of strangers who had never met Karen but had all encountered Karen before. Screenshots of her green-stained face became memes. People flooded the local community pages with laughing emojis and green heart reactions. And then came the hashtags. Hashtag Green Karen. Hashtag Karma in the Pool. Hashtag Entitled and Emerald. The nickname stuck. Karen Thompson wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was an internet legend. The fallout. By Monday morning, Karen's professional life began to crumble. Michael hadn't needed to contact her real estate agency. Her clients had done it for him. Their Facebook page was overwhelmed with angry comments. Would you trust an agent who breaks into people's houses? Does this company support trespassing? I'm in the market for a new home, but maybe you should keep your employees under control first. The firm had no choice but to respond. A public statement was issued. At our agency, we uphold the highest standards of respect and professionalism. The actions depicted in recent footage do not reflect our company values. Effective immediately, we are severing all ties with Karen Thompson. Karen was fired on the spot, packing up and moving out. For the first time since she had declared war on Michael, Karen went silent. She no longer prowled the neighborhood, no longer stood by her window, glaring through the curtains. Her house, once the center of her self-importance, had gone eerily quiet. And then, one morning, Michael stepped outside to see something he hadn't expected so soon. A for SELE sign. Karen was leaving. It wasn't a question of if anymore. The question was how fast could she get out? Her downfall wasn't just a source of amusement. It had united the neighborhood. People who had never spoken to one another before were suddenly exchanging stories. I should have said something earlier, Mrs. Rodriguez admitted, shaking her head. Last year, she called the HOA on me because my Christmas decorations were too ethnic. She tried to get my son's basketball hoop taken down, the Johnsons added. She called the police on my niece's lemonade stand. Another neighbor chimed in. The stories poured out, one after another, as if a dam had broken. Karen had spent years bullying and manipulating the community into silence. Now, no one was afraid of her anymore. That weekend, Michael hosted a neighborhood barbecue, his first since moving in. The once divided community came together, sharing food, laughter, and for the first time in years, a sense of belonging. As the sun set, kids played in the yard, splashing happily in the same pool Karen had once tried to claim for herself. One of the neighborhood kids tiptoed past Karen's house in exaggerated stealth mode, wearing a snorkel and flippers. "Shoo," he whispered dramatically, "don't tell Karen." His parents burst out laughing. Michael just smiled, flipping another rack of ribs on the grill. Karen's presence was already fading, both from the street and from their minds. Karma always finds a way. A year later, life had returned to normal. The family who bought Karen's house was nothing like her. They were warm, kind, and had twin daughters who had joined the local swim team. Michael often let them practice in his pool, giving them pointers on their form. The security cameras were still there, but now they captured different moments: birthday parties, summer cookouts, neighbors helping one another instead of avoiding each other. One evening, as Michael sat on his patio, a new email popped up. The subject line caught his eye. "Remember Karen? You'll never guess what she's up to now." It was from a local news station, one that had covered the original story. Karen, it seemed, had moved to a new state. But some habits never die. This time, she wasn't demanding access to a pool. She was demanding access to someone else's private tennis court. Michael let out a low chuckle. He didn't even bother opening the email. He simply marked it as read, leaned back in his chair, and stretched his legs out toward the pool. The water rippled gently, clear and undisturbed. For the first time in a long time, it belonged only to him. Sometimes, the best way to deal with entitled people isn't through arguments, confrontation, or even anger. Sometimes, the best response is to simply let karma do its job. Michael had tried reasoning. He had tried setting boundaries. He had even tried law enforcement. But Karen had ignored every warning, every consequence, believing she was untouchable. In the end, it wasn't an argument that brought her down. It wasn't a fight. It was her own actions, played back for the world to see, that sealed her fate. She had trespassed, lied, and harassed. And for all her scheming, all her manipulation, she had been brought down not by a legal battle, not by force, but by a swimming pool and a little green dye. A fitting end, really. Michael learned something important from the experience. Bullies thrive in silence. They rely on people not speaking up, on neighbors being too afraid or too polite to push back. Karen had spent years making life difficult for others, and no one had stopped her because it had always seemed easier to look the other way. Until now, once the truth was exposed, once people saw her for who she really was, everything unraveled. And maybe that was the real lesson. Karma doesn't always work quickly, but when it arrives, it's unforgettable. So if you ever find yourself dealing with a Karen, whether it's a neighbor, a coworker, or just someone who thinks the world exists to serve them, remember this. You don't have to stoop to their level. You don't have to fight their battles for them. Just make sure you have good security cameras, and maybe keep some pool dye handy. If you enjoyed this story of sweet, satisfying karma, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more. Have you ever dealt with a Karen in your life? Drop a comment below and tell us your story. We'd love to hear it. And remember, sometimes the best way to handle entitlement isn't with confrontation. It's by letting karma make a splash. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.